Hello and welcome. I'm Valerie Paley, Senior Vice President and Sue Ann Weinberg Director of the Patricia D. Klingenstein Library at the New York Historical Society. Before we begin, I would like to thank Louise Mirror, our President and CEO, Pam Schaffler, Chair of the Board of Trustees, all of our trustees, Joyce B. Cowan, Diane Max and the late Adam Max, and the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation, along with our Chairman's Council, our members, and our many other generous donors. None of the work of New York Historical is possible without your continued and committed support. It has been a thrill for me to be recognized as the founding director of our Center for Women's History, the first such center of its kind within the walls of a major museum in the United States. In only a few short years, we've been able to accomplish so much in terms of scholarship, education, programs, collecting, and not least of all, exhibitions, all of which foreground women's critical role in American history. Since 2017, the Joyce B. Cowan Women's History Gallery has been the venue for no fewer than 9 important shows, including our current exhibition, Art for Change, the Artist and Homeless Collaborative. Tonight's program, Dressing Up, the Women Who Influenced French Fashion, will last approximately 45 minutes, including 15 minutes for questions and answers at the end, which you can submit via the Q&A function on your Zoom screen at any point during the presentation. The chat function has been disabled, so please do make sure to use the Q&A. After the presentation, we will get to as many questions as time allows. And now I'd like to introduce today's speakers, Elizabeth L. Block and Keren Ben-Horin. Elizabeth Block is an art historian and the senior editor in the Publications and Editorial Department at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. She has contributed to publications including American Art and West 86, a journal of decorative arts, design history, and material culture. Her book, Dressing Up, The Women Who Influenced French Fashion, is published by MIT Press and is available online at our NY History store and wherever books are sold. Our moderator, Keren Ben-Horin, is my colleague and an Andrew W. Mellon Predoctoral Awardee in Women's History and Public History at New York Historical. Keren is the co-creator of the documentary film, Mrs. G, which has been shown in over 20 film festivals around the world, including Paris, Moscow, New York, and Toronto. She has curated several fashion exhibitions in New York and Israel and co-authored the Fashion History Survey, She's Got Legs, A History of Headlines and Fashion. Keren is the editor of the book, The Sweater, A History, and contributed an essay to the publication Fashion, Agency, and Empowerment. She is currently pursuing a PhD in history at NYU, where she uses the lens of fashion and the body to examine the lived experiences of ordinary people in American cities. Welcome, Elizabeth and Keren.
Thank you, Valerie, for such a kind introduction. Good evening, Liz. I'm so excited to have you. I actually have your book here with me, and it's really beautiful, and you must be so proud of this accomplishment. The time period that you're focusing on, the second half of the 19th century, was written about very widely, especially in terms of fashion. It's certainly one of my favorite time periods. And it may look like there's nothing new to add, but your book gives us a fresh look at fashion during that time period. First, you center American women not as passive consumers of couture, but really as active participants, influencers. And the second thing that you do is you really refute this notion that trends flowed one way from Paris to the US. And the way you do this is by kind of zooming out and looking at fashion in the 19th century as this transatlantic, multifaceted economic system, really influenced by the work and the consumption of many different actors, most of them women. So I'm really interested to hear how you got interested in this topic in the first place.
Thank you, Keren. Thank you, Valerie, for that wonderful introduction. why don't we put a visual up on the screen so I can begin answering your questions. Let's immerse ourselves in the world of Paris in the late 19th century and also New York itself. We're here on a wintry evening, so I'm glad to look at some dresses of all seasons tonight. I want to thank you, Keren, for honing in on the main themes of my book, Dressing Up. You and I have a lot of research interests in common, and it's so rewarding to work with someone and talk with someone who sort of understands the whole project, and that's what I hope to bring to the audience tonight. The topic of American women buying French fashion in this period is endlessly fascinating to me. As you say, what I try to do in the book is restore this sense of equilibrium between the producers of the couture, which is the fancy French designs, and the patrons of the couture from the US, who were these wealthy women from all of the major urban centers. We'll be mostly talking about New York tonight, but I don't want to lose the thread of the fact that there were women buying French couture all over the US. So we're also I'm talking in my book about Chicago, Philadelphia, Washington, DC, New Orleans, Los Angeles, San Francisco, Cincinnati. People are coming from all over. Many of these women were traveling twice a year to Paris to buy the fashions, the latest of the moment. Some of the names that we want to keep in the background are familiar to us, especially for audience members in New York. The names we're talking, the families are the Astors, the Vanderbilts, the Schermerhorns, the Goulds, and then from the Midwest, the Glessners, McKays, Stanford. So we can keep those in the back of our minds. And many of us picture those names on buildings at Columbia University, NYU, Astor Place, Astor Hotel, et cetera. So yes, we're talking about wealthy American women who were spending family money. It was the money from their husbands and their fathers, but they were doing it with intention. And that's what I'm trying to get out in this book, is how clever they were with their spending and how collaborative the process really was between the women as consumers and the designers who were making the clothing. Just for context, I want to give a sense of the cost of the gowns that we'll be talking about. An average gown that by a major house in Paris might cost in, say, 1887, $1,600. That's the equivalent of about $47,000 today, and that's for one dress. So you asked me how I got into the topic to begin with, and as with many discussions, both of fashion and art, it started with Madame X by John Singer Sargent. Many of you will be familiar with this painting from that's in the Metropolitan Museum. John Singer Sargent painted it in 1883-84. And we know that Madame Gautreau, who is Madame X, was very involved in the decision-making of what she would wear and how she would present herself. There's a lot of research on Madame X. And at the time, about 4 years ago, I was starting to write an article on not just Gautreau's dress, but also her red hair. So I spent a lot of time in the galleries here at the Met looking at the red hair and the dress. I wrote up a draft of my paper, and I was starting to look at, what else is there to say about Madame X's scandalous sleeveless dress. Very famously, the strap on the right shoulder was originally painted falling down, and it was so scandalous that Sargent had to repaint it into the upward position that we see it in today. What else was there to say? And in the research, I came across this one document that said in the newspapers that Madame Gautreau was an ardent patron of the Maison Felix in Paris. And so I put that into the paper, and I was busy writing about the red hair and the crescent jewel on top. And I sent it to a colleague from the Graduate Center from the City University of New York. And he sent back some terrific comments. And one of the queries was, what's the Maison Felix? I think we need to know more about it. And that launched research that has lasted years on end. So I started digging into what the Maison Felix was. And the Maison Felix was a major player in French couture. It was a household name in Paris and in the US, so mentioned in the same breath as the House of Worth or the House of Doucet or Paquin, but we've really lost the thread on Maison Felix. So when I was starting to do this research, I was looking for all the garments that remain. There are a few in France and there's a few in the US. And one of the most terrific garments that it remains is this opera gown in the Fashion Institute of Design and Merchandising Museum in Los Angeles. And they've been wonderful partners on the Maison Felix research. They acquired this beautiful silk opera gown. You can see that it has the bustle protruding from the lower back, which was popular in the 1880s. The model's wearing her opera gloves and her opera headpiece, and it's a low-cut bodice that would have been appropriate for opera wear. And recently I was talking with the curator there, Keren Jones, and he said, we have the accompanying daughter's opera dress. And I said, what? It's just exquisite. They acquired this opera gown and the accompanying one that the daughter wore. And I said, so it was a child's opera gown? He said, no, the daughter, she was probably in her late teens or early 20s. So it wasn't a girl's gown, but it's a matching accompaniment. And there's so many themes that the launch into Maison Felix has brought to this project. But this is one of the highlights. So I've been tracking as many gowns by Felix as I can. It was a house that was in business in Paris from the mid 1860s until a sort of abrupt closing in 1901 that I wrote about in the article for West 86. And in this book, I devote an entire chapter to the Maison Felix and try to figure out why it's so abruptly closed. And from my digging, I found that there were financial troubles and a lot of different reasons for that right after the Paris Exposition of 1900. So I also want to show the interior of the Maison Felix to give everyone a sense of where American women were choosing their garments when they went to Paris. So Caroline Astor very famously went to Paris twice a year. She had a home in Paris. And would order, tens of gowns at a time. And so did many of these other women. And so you can envision them going into the salon of Maison Felix. These images are from a newspaper, a Parisian newspaper. And we're so lucky that they printed them. The Maison Felix had a multi-floor salon on one of the most fashionable streets in Paris. And they did a big renovation in 1892. And so there was press related to that. And then by 1894, we get these wonderful pictures, but you can get a sense that the business salon here was meant to look like a comfortable home salon that an upper class woman would feel at home in. So you see that there's this warm carpeting, there's drapery, there's greenery, and plenty of seating because there would have been a lot of waiting. And it might raise the question of where were the husbands at this moment. So the husbands were probably in some sort of waiting room, a drawing room that was made up for them downstairs, or they were at home and the women went shopping in twos or threes on their own. But it was very much a woman's space. So I can go on and on about the Maison Felix, but as you know.
So this is actually a great point for to stop for my next question because it directly relates to these interiors. Today, we think of couture fashion in American department stores as two very different entities, very different places. But in the 19th century, especially in the mid 19th century, they were very much closely linked. Can you explain how?
Sure. So let's see. I brought a couple of paintings by Jean Barro, which really come in handy for this discussion, but also for my research in general. Jean Barro was a painter of Parisian street life, and there's so many paintings that look directly at shopping practices. So there's such a gift that we have so many of them. But I like this one in particular because you see the shop girl carrying the large dress box for the patron. The patron, she's holding up her skirt so that it doesn't get dirty on the street of Paris. And she's about to get into her driver's horse and carriage and head home. So you get a sense of the patrons, you get a sense of the workers. If you look to the upper, on my screen, it's the upper left, you can catch the UCET. That is a cropped part of the sign for the House of Doucet, DOUCET. That was one of the competitors to the Maison Felix and to the House of Worth. And I just love this scene of bustling upper class, business. It really was business. So she's heading home with what she bought that day. This is another painting by Barro. On the upper right of the screen, you can see you can make out the PAQ of the House of Paquin, which was another major player in the scene, and a competitor to Felix, House of Worth, etc. But we see two women in their afternoon summer dresses. They perhaps have just finished shopping. Their doormen are guarding the entryway, and a new shopper is just coming out of her carriage to begin her shopping day. And of course, ubiquitous in these paintings from the period, I have to put on my art historian hat for a moment. You see in the middle right, a man reading a newspaper while he's walking down the street. So it really gives you a sense of where these women were and what they looked like when they were spending their money. So that was the French scene. So that's the couture scene that we have our eye on. Now we're all familiar with department stores. So how do they relate? So on the left, I'm showing you this etching of Lord & Taylor in New York. This was their new location on Broadway and 20th. This is the elevator of the new location. And on the right, this box for face powder that's in New York Historical. And it's branded Lord & Taylor, but it's a French product that's coming into the US to the department stores. So the department stores were they were democratic marketplaces. Anyone could go in. This was new. You could browse. You didn't have to buy. And large windows, carpeting, salons, restaurants to make the shopper comfortable. But the point I'm trying to make is to show that New York and all the major urban centers were beginning to have these democratic department stores. They grew out of the earlier history of the dry goods stores. They were selling American goods, but they were also equally selling European goods, mostly French. And when you have the women as the main consumer, you get perfume, powders, dresses, and many of the couture dresses in garments from Paris were sold directly in the US department stores. And of course, that leads to eventually to copying. And I have a chapter in the book on the afterlife of couture and the underside. So people were copying designs and selling them with faux labels on them.
You mentioned scent, and I thought that was one of the most fascinating things that I've learned in your book, that you really talk about sort of like this role that perfumers and hairdressers played in the fashion system of the period. And we don't often think about perfume or scent as integral to fashion trends, but you tell a more complex story, and I would love for you to share a little bit of that.
Thank you for honing in on the idea of the scent. And I think what you're getting at is that there were other players in the fashion industry in addition to, and partners with the couturiers. So the couturiers were the dress designers and makers, but also within this fashion system where, again, you have this balance between all of the participants, we need to also be looking at hairdressers, the coiffeurs, we need to be looking at the perfumers, we need to be looking at the people who sold, the companies that sold shipping trunks and the actual shippers, and then dry cleaners. We have invoices from women in the United States for, dry cleaners and cleaners of clothing from when they visited France. So there were all of these providers of services. And what I try to show in the book is how they were all reliant upon one another and how they had to give a little, you couldn't just, a milliner, someone who made a hat, selling hats and bonnets and headwear, could not just decide on what the styles would be that season, because they had to keep in mind what the hairstyles were that season and what the dress designs were that season. So they were all reliant upon one another. And I love this image. This is from this house called L'Enterique, who I kept seeing come up in the periodicals. And I kept thinking, I'm seeing this name. Who is this? What business is this? L'Enterique was a large company that did hair services and also perfume services. And so this image, I do a lot with hair studies, and so this image shows the inside of the hair salon at L'Enterique, it was up to the minute. It's shampooing in the American style specifically, which is shampooing with water. US buildings had better plumbing because they were newer. And that's an example of a practice that went from the US over to Europe. So we see that these men are washing these women's hair, their heads are forward. I'm not sure why the sink wasn't in the back. And then this contraption that you see sort of in the middle right is an early hair dryer on wheels, which I think is terrific. It's one of the earliest representations that I've seen.
Incredible.
It's really great. And I only recently honed in and noticed that it was on wheels, so it could go from chair to chair. So this is L'Enterique's hair salon, but then they also, to get back to your question about scent, they also had this floral workshop. So here they would have been, these women, they're working, and they would have been making, fashioning silk flowers. But then you can also see the bottles on the shelf of perfumes. And there's another picture that I didn't bring, men working in the basement who are mixing in vats the perfume scents, because all women had to have their own signature scent. So we know, violets or roses, and each, Caroline Astor, Alva Vanderbilt, they each had their favorite scent.
And you also talk about dresses that have scent sewn into them, which is totally fascinating to me.
So I thought, when I was looking at these pages in the French periodicals, like this here's one example from 1858, I kept, I had my eye at the bottom inscription to see who the couturiers were of the dresses. And then I noticed that the coiffures were being credited as well. And then I noticed that the perfumiers were being credited. And I thought that's so fascinating, because when you're looking at you get the current fashion plate periodical, and you're at home and you're looking at it, why, you're supposed to also be thinking about scent at the same time, which you can't pick up from looking at the page, but they're credited pretty constantly. And here's one from 1878. We get the dress is designed by Lefebvre, which is another house that you need to know more about. I love this black and green with the low bustle at the back. And the perfumier was Legrand, who is all over the place in these periodicals. So it was a popular house along with L'Enterique. So to get to back to the question about sewing the scent into the dresses. So I was thinking, why are we seeing the perfumiers credited so much, all part and parcel with the dresses? And it was because I later found out that many of the couturiers would sew in silk sachets into the waistlines of the dresses. So you could have your signature scent in your dress. So when you went to the party or, a ball after the opera, you would be identified not only by what you're wearing, but also by your scent. And I've been trying to find an image of a silk sachet, which would have been about 2 inches by 2 inches square. Don't have one yet, but I brought this image of a perfume sachet from New York Historical. This one's made out of paper, but you can just get a sense of how, I mean, this is pretty, cheaply done. And it's done in New York, but these were printed in multiples, but you can get a sense of it.
So let's talk about parties.
One of my favorite topics.
Yeah, everyone's. So fancy balls. They were another very important arena for fashion for rich Americans in this time period. And they were very widely reported, which is great for historians. But I wanted to ask you if you could talk a little bit about if and what was the difference between fancy balls wear and couture wear for dinner parties or the opera or other venues?
Right. So couture is the high-end handmade gowns, dresses, and other wear that we have mostly been talking about. The major houses also would provide fancy ball wear. So we use the term fancy ball wear rather than costume in this time period. But really, there was no stigma toward a major designer producing costumes for parties or for theater, for the stage, for actresses. And that's, another point in the book is that wealthy women from America are the focus, but some of those wealthy women were also actresses because they made money while they were on the stage, and they were also patronizing these designers. And for fancy balls, just to give us a sense of the moment, I'm showing this image of Mrs. George Cabot Lodge from New York Historical. It's from 1898. It's a miniature watercolor on ivory. And in the research, I found these miniatures to be very helpful. They are so brilliant. I mean, they're small, but they're so detailed. And there's a trend toward showing more of the fancy ball wear in these miniatures. It was sort of like a keepsake where if you were commissioning a large painting like by Sargent or by Carolus Duran or something like that, you probably wouldn't do a costume. But here, these are such wonderful records. And here she's in 18th century wear with powdered hair, with the low-cut bodice and a fan. And another example is Mrs. Howland. She's wearing an ermine-lined cape, and she's holding her little dog. Someone will know the type of dog it is. And, this beaded bodice and pearls and, the exquisite jewelry and sort of just, draped in fur. There was a lot of fur in the period. But to get to the question at hand, you see fancy ball dress from Maison, Paquin, Worth, because it was the height of entertaining. It was the height of the social season. In 1883, Alva Vanderbilt very famously had her housewarming ball at her new home on 5th Avenue and 52nd Street. She had come from the South. She was from Alabama, but she married into the Vanderbilt family and wanted to break into New York society. She had this huge mansion built and helped design it and everything. And then she wanted to have the best of society from the 400, Mrs. Astor's 400 and Ward McAllister's list of 400 socialites come to a fancy ball party, but she didn't provide instructions on what period to come in. So people came in dress of all periods. Here is Alva Vanderbilt. She dressed as a woman from the Renaissance, probably inspired by a painting. And you get a lot of props in these images. So she chose doves. And it's a photograph by Mora in New York Historical. We're very lucky that these are still around. And, directly to your question, we see here the very famous electric light dress that Charles Frederick Worth, who was the founder of the House of Worth, made for Alice Claypool Gwynne Vanderbilt, who was the sister-in-law of Alva Vanderbilt's husband. You see that she wanted a fancy ball dress on a current theme. And what was more, on point than electric light? She commissioned this gown from him. It's exquisite. I had the pleasure of seeing it at the Fashion Institute of Technology Museum a couple of years ago. It's petite. She was probably about 5'1". It's very shiny. It's less yellow than in the photograph, but you could see the sleeves of tinsel and all the detail. The tinsel picks up the lighting in the room, and you can just imagine how sparkling it was in its time period. Charles Frederick Worth created it with a prop. So she has, you can see on the photograph at the right, she has a battery powered torch and she's holding it in this image. So this was just the height of it. And again, it's okay to have a couturier make your costume for a party. Here she is, she's seated on the right and her husband's on the left. He's dressed as a duke. You can see his powdered wig. And how did people decide what they wanted to wear to the ball and what to commission from their French designers? They used handbooks. Ardern Holt's handbook was called Fancy Dresses Described. It went into many different editions over the years. It's sort of a glimpse into the zeitgeist of the moment. So it's by theme, and there are themes all the way from chocolatier to newspaper, telegraph, Shakespearean characters, and Hornet was a very popular one. And I'm showing that page right now from his book. And then on the right is another wonderful photograph by Mora of Constant Reeves Borland. You can see that she asked her dressmaker to adhere pretty closely to Holt's handbook, but she used a little poetic license and went sleeveless instead of sort of almost a turtleneck, if you will. And you can see the wings at the back, which is a nice touch. And the background, of course, was a backdrop for the photographer. And photographers were sent to the Vanderbilt Ball to document it.
So I'm sure anyone looking at those images is thinking, all of this work, all of this investment in resources and money and all of that for one night. This is where your book provides another really interesting insight, because you kind of talk about this other secondary market almost for recycling and repurposing a lot of these couture clothes. Some of those clothes you say have had second, sometimes third lives. Can you tell us more about that and how that kind of influenced the fashion system as a whole, not just the very wealthy?
Yes, this is in a chapter in the book, The Afterlife and Underworld of French Couture. There are many different facets to the long life of these garments. As an example, I'm showing this dress on the left by Melanie Pascoe, another house that needs some research. This is the only dress I know from that house at the moment, from about 1878. It was owned by Francis Drexel Paul of Pennsylvania. You'll recognize the name from Drexel University. The painting by Drake on the right of her, it's the same gown, but with a different bodice. And you can see that it's been a number of years, over a decade, and she's still, wearing the dress, reusing it as, if you will. So she had this secondary bodice made so that she could stretch the life of the garment. And this is one of the main points in the book, is that these women had so much money. Their husbands were running railroads and silver mines and, the steel makers and real estate titans of industry. But there was also a pragmatism to their shopping practices, where they knew fabrics very well, and they knew what their dressmaker could do, and they knew what they could get done locally versus what they needed to get done in France. She may have had a local dressmaker make the bodice. In fact, we're pretty sure that that's what she had done here, and she got to wear it again. Another example is Frances Folsom Cleveland. You'll remember that she married sitting President Grover Cleveland in 1886. She was much younger than he was. I think she was 22 years old when she got married. She had quite a sense of style, and she was married in what we're pretty sure she was married in a dress by Worth. And because her image was reproduced so much, her fashion choices were copied by people. But so I'm showing this terrific, another miniature from New York Historical. It's just exquisite. You can also get a sense of her hairstyle, which was copied by many people, with sort of this fringe of curls in the front. But her image was reproduced many times without her signature, so illegally reproduced on anything from, cigar boxes to you name it. Here's an advertising plotter from New York Historical with her image on it. You could see she was a style icon that people would pick up on. And I'm focusing on her here because she was known to reuse and to rewear and to recycle, using contemporary terms. This is an ensemble that's in the National Museum of American History that we know was made by the House of Doucet. Remember the Baroque painting where we saw the sign? It has two bodices, and we know that the peach-colored one on the right was made by Doucet. It came originally with the dress, but she also, like Drexel, had a secondary bodice made, and she had it made by a local dressmaker, Lottie Barton from Baltimore. So it gives you a sense that even first ladies were following these practices of getting the most out of their purchases. And so what did they do with them when they were finally done? They would either donate them, they could give them to their maids, which happened fairly often, or they could sell them to a secondhand proprietor. So there were secondhand people who would sell these garments to middle-class shoppers. So middle-class women could go to a secondhand shop in, say, New York or London even, and that's where you get this dissemination of the garments and of the styles. You can quickly see how the styles made their way around, and also, if you will, the trickle-down effect.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. That's totally fascinating. It's really incredible. And the last topic that I wanted to touch upon before we open up for questions is this really interesting aspect that we don't often think about when, especially, people who look at research of fashion, the fashions, the designs. We don't really think about it in economic terms, but I wanted you to talk a little bit about the role of taxes and duties and how that affected the movement of products between the US and France.
Right. There's a historian who calls this period the age of the tariff. There were tariffs every couple of years that would come through, different senators sponsoring them. There was the famous McKinley tariff. But what they did was, and here I brought this image of custom officers examining the trunks of women who were returning from trips abroad. There's so much in this image, but it gives you a sense of how, first of all, the volume of fashion that was coming in, the sort of like the clinical aspect, the sterile aspect of customs needing to see what you bought and to determine the proper tariffs on the spot. So we have accounts of women being searched for not just what was in their trunks, but if they looked like they were coming off the ship, sort of steamship, sort of bulky, whether they were smuggling in a second dress underneath, or if they had sewn in, accessories, jewelry into the seams of their dresses. So there is this economic history that runs through the whole topic of American women buying French fashion, I was concerned that I would scare away some readers with the chapter on tariffs, but I'm told that that the anecdotes of women getting stopped with their wedding, going to Paris and buying a wedding dress and then getting stopped at customs is somewhat entertaining. But it gives us a sense, it gives an idea of how much money was flowing and how the US government was trying to get a piece of it. And perhaps rightly so, as a protectionist measure. They were trying to protect US industries, and all over the papers, there were criticism of some of these big purchases by Carolyn Astor, for example, saying, basically, why don't you buy local? And, but the women knew their fabrics and they wanted the best of the best, and that came from Paris.
And how these issues of tariffs, duties, taxes, how did that influence, copying and smuggling?
Right. So the rampant smuggling and rampant copying were happening. We know that there are accounts of women being arrested they were hired by some department stores, or local dressmakers would hire women or go themselves to Paris to spy on the latest styles, and then to make sketches and come back and copy them, and perhaps put a fake label into the garment. So it affects the amount of income that the designers and the couturiers in Paris were making. And so they fight back. And that's a really interesting moment too, where they say, we really need this business. Some of them decided, we can't take this hit. So we'll meet you where you are, and we will copy, we'll let you have our designs. We'll bring them down a notch, and then you can sell them under your name. So there's a lot of collaboration.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Liz, thank you. I'm going to invite Valerie back for the Q&A portion. And we'll let people ask questions.
Put my contact information there if anybody needs it.
Hi, and that was absolutely fantastic. And fun fact, this is my period too as a scholar, and I'm particularly curious. We're talking about expense and the unbelievable monetary value of the garments, but I'm also, and the selling of these goods, but I'm also curious about the selling of aspiration, of a kind of European aspiration to aristocracy that Americans had in this period, and how do you feel as though, the beauty of these garments notwithstanding, they represented something that Americans just couldn't have as Americans, in terms of just political hierarchies. And they were trying to affect this look of aristocratic behavior and clothing.
There's no question about it. They were emulating European royalty to an extent. It runs throughout this entire moment, and it does affect their choices for sure. And that's why at these fancy balls, you see the women dressing as, a Renaissance princess, and the husbands all came as a Louis, a Louis 14, 15. They're dressing as kings, and to an extent, it's a curious choice, because in many cases they choose, a monarch who would later get beheaded. But there was no real concern for the actual history. It was by image, and they would have costumes copied from portraiture.
Which is fascinating. I'm so delighted that our sister institution, the Museum of City, New York, has many of these Worth costumes, and it's quite extraordinary to see them, viscerally have an impression of what they were and the detail that's involved. And actually, I think you did relay this, but I'm just curious, where in fact did all of the fabric, where was it made? What sort of weavers created the fabric? Was it from Asia? Was it from Europe? Was it local? What?
And Keren, jump in anytime if you please. Do you want to take this one?
Sure.
Yeah.
A lot of the fabrics during that time period were made in France, and they were earlier periods where French government itself was trying to block, textiles coming from India, from other places, and that really sort of like fueled the local industry in France. So a lot of the
Interesting.
fabrics, the couture fabrics would have been locally made in France, in Lyon, and other places.
So there's a whole fashion industrial complex in a way, right? One of the questions that comes from the chat is, to what extent did any of the couture, perfumes, et cetera, trickle down to the middle classes on either side of the Atlantic? My question essentially, was fashion aspirational among different social strata during this time period?
Keren, do you want to take perfume?
Well, I can say more generally that this time period is really interesting in terms of, we think about sort of like this idea of trickling down and bubbling up, and I think we most associate this time period with trickling down, but we also have a little bit of bubbling up, where we see, for example, and you showed, I think, that black, that miniature that had that black bodice. And I think black, for example, is a color that during that time period is worn by salespeople in department stores in both sides of the ocean. And that really kind of started becoming a fashionable color for women, which was not the case before kind of 1880s, 1890s. So that's like an interesting example of, going the other way. But, in the US, we had a very big industry for paper patterns. So companies would sell paper patterns based on fashion plates coming from couture salons, and that will be then purchased by middle-class women. They would take it to their own dressmakers, or we also have the sewing machine coming into play during that time period, so women would make their own clothes. So for sure there was trickling down of fashion and styles, trimmings, hats, all of the accessories, all of that would have been slowly coming from the couture houses into lower markets.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned black, and this just, at what point did black become less the color of mourning and more the color of sophistication?
So I think it's during that time period when we're starting seeing this transition. I mean, it comes more into play in the beginning of the 20th century, but it's for sure this time period where women, especially towards the end of the century, where we see women are becoming more active. They're starting to do sports. They go in the city by themselves. They go around. They're riding bikes. Women are becoming more active in the public sphere, and I think wearing black and wearing more kind of pared down looks is very much happening towards the end of the century, and black comes into play. It really associated with menswear. So women are adopting a lot of those styles. Jackets, like tailored jackets, are becoming fashionable in the 1890s. So this is the time period where we see kind of morning dress, black coming into play, not just as in morning dress.
And of course, Madame Gaudreau, Madame X, she made black. She put black on the map for elegance.
For sure.
So another question that comes to us, as you look at history through the lens of fashion, do you also see the influence of historical developments on fashion, i.e. wars, influencing the availability of fabric and the role of women? I mean, I think you touch on this with sports, for example, but how does a historical context impact the way we look at, or the way designs sort of come to be? And is this really pertinent to the discussion of fashion in the Gilded Age? I'm just curious, Liz.
Yeah, the only hardships that this, very small percentage of this late 19th century group of women that we're seeing. The only hardships that I see in the documents and in their letters and the memoirs is really the tariffs at the moment, that they're trying to avoid them, and that it does go through waves, and there are different economic waves. There are various depressions. There's the Panic of 1893, and it's remarkable how they're really insulated from that. Later, there are works by many other scholars who look at the effect of world wars on fashion in later periods, and where they're paring down what accessories. Of course, we know that from films and World War II documentaries.
Right. But I mean, actually, it's interesting because along those same lines, you did mention, and it was a question in the chat, and you addressed it before I could ask it to you, but that is, these women, if they wore the clothes just once or maybe repurpose them, but then wore them again, what happened to them? Why did they put them in what essentially is a 19th century reel to be repurposed for the middle one? They had enough money. What difference did it make? Why was it so important that they not wear these clothes again?
Keren, do you want to?
I think it's such a great question.
Yeah.
Maybe I can only speculate that there was so much labor put into these garments that even when they were worn out, it was very hard to just throw them away.
But to only wear them once or twice, or
that I don't know that. Maybe fancy dress they did not wear again, but I'm sure that the dresses that they had, they wore more than once. I'm certain. It is true that during that time period, women of, elite women like that would have changed their clothes several times a day. So they did have a lot of clothes. But I do think they were cherished, and I do think that they were worn. And maybe Liz, you can talk, but you've seen some of those dresses.
Well, yeah,
in the collection. Where did they have, sweat stains? Did they look like they were worn and loved?
Yeah, I've had the real honor of looking and studying and visiting some of the dresses that we have here in the Costume Institute at the Met. And yes, there are signs of wear, sweat stains. There's dirt stains that that fashion conservators work with in really unbelievably considered ways. There's signs of wear, there's signs of reuse, there's signs of moving the seams. So if someone was re-wearing, we saw the dress by Pascoe worn by Drexel, she's wearing the dress 12 years later, she may have had a few kids by then. So you do see the seams coming in and out at various times in women's lives. So there's reworking sort of, under the hood, if you will. And then to your point about, how they cherished the garments, I think a lot of that goes to their knowledge of fabrics. Women in this period, everyone knew how to sew, even the elite women. If they didn't want to do it, they had people to do it, but they still had the skills, and they had such a deep knowledge of, which silks were the finest, what satin would go best with a certain combination. And we see that in the women's letters and in the diaries and in their shopping journals of how they were picking the fabrics alongside the designer. So again, that balance between the producer and the consumer. But I think, again, yes, cherishing the fabrics and knowing how much goes into the highest of the high quality.
We're almost out of time, but I cannot let this question go by, and that is really one of the designers. Worth, of course, figures very seriously in this whole narrative and in this whole period, but there are other designers, and I'm just curious, as a consumer of fashion myself, did the designers, when we see them through 21st century eyes, the costumes look essentially the same. Some are more opulent than others. given the detail or the fabric or whatever, but was there a real sense of, oh, well, this is Balenciaga and this is, Prada, like there was a real sense of a different, if you went with Worth, you got this, if you went with another designer, you've got something else, or was it really all part of the same movement and moment in fashion?
So that gets to the question of branding, and
Mhm.
yes, the House of Worth hovers over this whole narrative. There's no way to avoid it, and there's no reason why we should. That the house is very well documented. We have all the business records in the Victoria and Albert Museum, and we have so many extant garments by the House of Worth to study. We're very lucky at that. That was the first house to start branding, to put their label, the Worth label, into the waist of the garments, to give it that imprimatur of getting it from there. What I do with the Maison Felix and what I've found is that they sort of catered to and the hourglass women. So they were known for their slim designs. House of Worth, if you want to set them up as a foil to the Maison Felix, for example, was more known for more, decoration, more opulence, for women of all ages, but just more to it. It's very difficult to get at, and a lot of the garments that survive don't have labels in them. It's very difficult to know what you're looking at until you get really, really deep into the garments and into you need to compare what remains in the garment, the look of the garment, to fashion plates of the period, which is, a very fun and fabulous pursuit.
Well, we could go on, and I have more questions, and so do we have more questions in the chat, but we unfortunately have run out of time. And I do want to thank Elizabeth Block and Keren Ben-Horin for being with us today. And please, all of you out there, please sign up for our mailing list and follow us at nyhistory.org to get the latest on upcoming salons like this one. You can purchase a copy of the book, Dressing Up, online at the NY History Store. Finally, the New York Historical Society is currently open on Wednesday through Sunday. You can reserve your timed entry museum tickets on our website, and we do hope to see you on Central Park West in person to view the exhibition Black Dolls in our Smith Gallery, opening February 25th, and Art for Change, the Artist and Homeless Collaborative, in our Joyce B. Cowan Women's History Gallery until April 3rd. And we do thank you again, and do have a great night and stay safe.